So I read quite a bit of manuscripts last year, especially a lot of the openings to books, and I found about 7 common mistakes. So, see if you're guilty of one of these top 7 mistakes. Welcome to Ginger's Creative Corner. We are Christian nerdy storytellers here. We talk about how to tell really good, impactful stories through a Christian lens. And today we're going to go over some of the most common mistakes I've noticed recently. Throughout my time writing, I have noticed the kinds of mistakes that writers make. Some are universal throughout time, and then some are more kind of on trend. So we're going to talk about those. First mistake that I realized when reading, especially speculative fiction, is a lack of setting and world building. And I think maybe some of this comes from just not having the world built up enough, but I think also from the advice of don't info dump. So a lot of people are trying to avoid having long descriptions, which is good, but then they're skipping a lot of setting details, which is extremely important in speculative fiction, but it's also important no matter what genre you're writing in. Readers need to be able to picture the world that your characters are in, even if the setting is modern and they can fill in some of the blanks, there's still specifics that need to be in there. Because when you're lacking scenery details, more than just the background is missing. The tone of your story is heavily affected by settings. And if your setting is not there, you're missing out on a tone. Are you setting up something kind of creepy, whimsical, romantic, gritty? The reader's not going to feel that if your setting descriptions are just not there. And like I've said in previous videos, it's okay if setting descriptions doesn't come naturally to you as a writer. That's what editing is for. So even if your first draft or two is missing a lot of those details, you do want to consciously go back and make sure you're adding them in. One easy recommendation that I have is to go to each scene that you have written and try to hit 4 out of 5 of the senses. So sight, taste, touch, smell, or what you hear. Common mistake number 2 that I see a lot is characters who are a trope. A lot of writers are inspired by tropes, and that's okay. You can be inspired by a trope, but you don't want your character to stay stuck in a trope. If you don't develop the character beyond the trope that inspired you, they're going to become one-dimensional. And most readers pick up the book because it sounds interesting, but they stay because they love the characters. So if your characters are not engaging and grabbing your reader's attention, they're going to put your book down. So it's okay if you want to have the grumpy sunshine pairing, but there should be more to them. Why is this person grumpy? Why did they put on that hard exterior? What's really behind all the sunshine? There should be more depth to the characters. Number 3, this is a big one that I see a lot. Main characters without agency or who do not drive the plot. Now, like I said, this is a major one I see all the time. Even people who are really good at the technical side of writing make this mistake. I know I've been guilty of making the same mistake in past manuscripts as well. So we're all in good company. I would even venture to say that most writers probably go through this phase. So what does this mistake look like? It's when life is happening to the character instead of the character making decisions. And I think this often happens when an author is trying to portray a certain type of character. For example, characters who want the simple life or they're happy with the way that life is now. Also could be known as the reluctant hero, or that the main character has a passive personality and is kind of drifting through life. Because some real people do drift through life while letting life happen to them. And so a lot of authors want to portray those kinds of people. And the last one is a character that lives an oppressed life. So they're beaten down and maybe even suffer from learned helplessness. So those are, I think, some of the 3 major types of characters I see when a story has this problem. So I will say, fortunately, you can still have these kinds of characters while also making them drive the story. So we'll talk about how to do that. The reluctant main character. This character is happy with the way that life is. Perhaps they've embraced the simple life and they've got good things going on. And they don't want any grand adventure. But us authors are definitely going to make them go on one, kicking and screaming if needed. So it's okay if they don't want to go on the adventure that the inciting incident is pushing them towards. But they still need to make decisions. So they can actively fight against their main character fate until there's the turning point where they can no longer deny that they have to take responsibility, or you have to give them something where they're going to reluctantly decide they're going to go on this adventure. For example, Frodo in Lord of the Rings is happy with the life that he has. When he inherits the One Ring and he learns of the danger of it, he reluctantly accepts the duty that has befallen him. Now, that's an example of a character who doesn't really want to, but will. Now, a character who fights against their fate is also a very common trope, and they have to actively make decisions to avoid it until circumstances forces them. What we want to avoid is a character that is getting shuttled from one plot point to the next, where all the other characters are dragging them along, or they're basically tumbling down a mountain until they get where they need to go. They have to make the decision. So characters that are just drifting through life. This comes from the very real world problem of apathy and feeling purposeless. And a lot of authors do want to portray those kinds of characters and show a growth with them or explore what it means to feel like that. And this is an issue I see largely by male writers with male main characters. And I think there's definitely something socially to say about that, but that's a conversation for another time. But you still can have these types of characters who are drifting through life and they feel that they have no purpose. However, when the inciting incident happens, it needs to trigger a change in their life. No one wants to read about an apathetic character throughout 80,000 plus words. It is very dreary. On top of them being a boring character to follow, it's also unrealistic because even people who are struggling with apathy or even depression, they still have dreams and goals. They just feel out of reach or unattainable. So you want your main character to still have dreams and goals, things that they want to accomplish, even if they feel like there's no point in pursuing them. And that's where your inciting incident can come in. It can give them a spark to perhaps pursue one of the goals that they have in life that they thought that was unattainable. And the last category we talked about is oppressed characters. Unlike the apathetic characters, I see this one a lot with female main characters written by women authors. So this happens when they're writing a character who has been very heavily oppressed by society or family structure. And they're a very meek and unassertive character, and they're afraid of confrontation. And I think a lot of women find themselves, I mean, people in general, but like I said, it's more common that I see in women writers. They relate to this. However, this is another problem with main characters is if they have this personality, they do need to make decisions. Otherwise, they're being shuttled from one scene to the next, and they're not fun to read. But once again, they're also not realistic. These types of characters also need depth. They need something that drives them, something that keeps them hopeful, that keeps them going. A good example is Disney's Cinderella. On the surface, she might seem like one of these types of characters, but she's not. Sure, she lives under her evil stepmother and her stepsister's thumb, and she doesn't fight against them, but she does dream of a better life. She does work hard, and we even get to see snippets of her personality throughout. She's not a broken shell of a person being shuttled from one scene to the next. We see that she's really kind to mice. She has an attitude with Lucifer the cat, and she even scolds Bruno for his behavior. We get to see different facets of her personality. She's not just a meek character that is not driving the story. Katniss from the Hunger Games is another good example of a character that lives in an oppressed society. Granted, she is not meek, but she's a good example of how you can have a character who lives in oppression without them being completely broken and boring to follow as a main character. We see from her, she doesn't actively fight against her society. She does break the law to go hunting, but she's driven by the need to protect and take care of her family. We even see, though, in the beginning, where she believes the cat is a useless mouth to feed, she still keeps it around because her sister loves it. So we see that she has a soft side underneath this hard exterior. And she is a serious and pessimistic character, unlike Cinderella, who's a little more positive. But Katniss doesn't wallow in her misery. She gets up and she works hard. And that is its own kind of hope. I find that a lot of these kinds of oppressed characters who are just drifting through life happens a lot in dystopian type novels. The genre is really popular right now, so a lot of people are writing them, but they're failing to capture the spark of humanity even within oppressive systems. And readers don't want to follow a hopeless, miserable character. They want to see that there's something about them that fights against the oppression, whether it's they're holding out hope, or they're doing what they need to do to get by, or they're actively fighting against the oppressive system. Give readers something. And at the very least, give them a dark sense of humor. So remember, the world might be defeated, but your hero shouldn't be. I'll say an example of a book that does this really well is The Mistress. The main character lives in an oppressive family. She's not really granted agency, and she's very rule following. So she does what she's told. But the inciting incident comes in when she has a moment of frustration and she does something she normally wouldn't have done. Now, it makes sense within the situation that the character is put in, so it's not out of character, but it's something that she normally wouldn't have done, becomes a huge mistake, and then it spurs her to action and to have to change from a passive victim to someone who has to make decisions, and she grows stronger as a character, or she grows stronger as a person. So remember, your character should be making decisions even if they're the wrong ones. All right, number 4 on the list of common mistakes I see is unrealistically traumatizing characters. Oh boy, this is one I see a lot, especially in sci-fi and fantasy manuscripts. So this happens when the writer needs the main character to suffer some significant trauma, and it tends to happen at the hands of people like soldiers or the government or the big evil bad guy. And this is a common thing to do in fiction. So it's not wrong to do that. Traumatize your characters, go ahead. But the problem happens when it's done in an unrealistic way. And this usually looks like when soldiers or parents or who have you are absolutely unhinged in a way that doesn't follow an internal logic. And they become either cartoony or eye rollingly bad. And no matter how evil a regiment is, soldiers don't go around slaughtering whole villages because someone bumped into them. It's extremely unrealistic, and it's not a good way to show how evil a regime is. It would make more sense if maybe they slapped around the one person who bumped into them, but I have seen multiple times where it'll be like a kid runs into them or says something, and then all the soldiers end up slaughtering everybody. It's not realistic. Soldiers have commands they have to follow and a sense of order that they have to maintain. If the big bad guy, evil king, wanted the village destroyed, they would have ordered that. And there's going to be heavy consequences if soldiers just act out of pocket like that. So make sure your big bad guys follow an internal logic and most of all strategy. And that's not just evil kings and tyrants. The bad evil parents need to follow some sense of logic and strategy as well. And next week, I'm going to go a little more in depth on the internal logic issues because this is one I see a lot, but going in along with such violence. Let's talk about big mistake number 5, starting your book with a mass slaughter. In going with the same vein of traumatizing your character, number 5, do not start your book with a mass slaughter. I cannot tell you how common this is. I have read so many manuscripts that start with a mass slaughter, and I get it. You hear advice, start with action. But that's not what action means. And there's so many reasons not to start it this way. One, a lot of authors are trying to start their books this way. So if you do, you're not standing out, especially if you want to be traditionally published. I From how many books I've read where it started like that, I can only imagine how many books agents have read that start like that. And if you're trying to indie publish, I'm going to be honest, if you have a book that starts like this, I'm going to put it down because I see it so often, and it tells me you probably haven't gone through developmental editing, and I'm not going to waste my time. I will say there are a few exceptions to this, and that's not when I'm going to get into it because it's the exception. But most of the time, if you are starting a book with any sort of mass slaughter, you're starting at the wrong spot. So I'm not saying this can't be somewhere in your book or even in your character's backstory, but you shouldn't start the book with one. And I would say don't put it in the first 2 chapters if you are going to have a mass slaughter at some point in the story. One big thing is that readers need to care about the character and the place before you start people. And if this happens in the first 2 chapters, your readers haven't gotten enough time to get attached to people or to really settle in. So it's like starting your book with a fight scene. Why are they going to care? And if there's a time skip that follows the mass slaughter, this especially goes for you. Like, especially. I always recommend starting the book at the time skip and let the slaughter just inform the character's traumatic backstory. Believe me, it'll be more impactful if you leave it as character backstory and who they are now than if you try to spell it out in the beginning of the book. Number 6 is telling instead of showing. So even if your story doesn't suffer from one of the issues 1 through 5, if you are telling instead of showing, you are going to immediately lose readers. So don't worry, while it will require some rewrites, once you learn the concept of showing, it's an easy, lengthy fix. And if you haven't seen, I have a video on show versus tell where I go into depth on what it looks like and how to fix it. And before we get to the biggest mistake I see, which is number 7, if you like what we do here at Ginger's Creative Corner, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a nice comment. That is a completely easy and free way to support what we do here. We are now open to members here on YouTube. So if you'd like to support us that way, you can become a member. Or if you would like to subscribe to our Substack, we're going to start having a monthly newsletter where you can see some of the behind the scenes and the personal creative projects that we're working on. Now, number 7, this is the biggest mistake I see new and experienced writers make, is starting at the wrong place. And yeah, I've been guilty of this one too. I would venture to say the majority of authors have. And this is why you're going to edit that opening chapter more times than you would like. So I found that years ago, the issue used to be that writers they started too soon. Now I'm finding the opposite problem is that they're starting the stories too late. And I think this is a result of a hard overcorrection where everyone was saying start with action, start as close to the inciting incident as possible. And so writers took that to heart and now they've overcorrected largely. So when you start a story too soon, it drags on and is boring. You don't need to see the rundown of the character's everyday life before the inciting incident happens. The inciting incident should be within the first 10% of the story and typically within the first chapter. Now, the opposite problem is when you're starting too late. When this happens, the reader doesn't have enough time to figure out who the characters are, what the life is like, what's the setting like. They're suddenly thrown into chaos without ever knowing what the normal was like. While I was thinking about what's causing this problem, I think I figured out what might be going wrong in many cases. I think it's a lot of people don't know what an inciting incident looks like. Many authors think that an inciting incident needs to be loud and flashy and exciting, but that's not true. Inciting incidents are usually a little more subtle than that. Your inciting incident can be an explosion, but most of the time it's not going to be. What an inciting incident is the disruption from the normal. It's going to be the catalyst for change in your main character's life. So some examples, let's go back to Cinderella. The inciting incident is when there's the invitation to the ball. It's not when her fairy godmother shows up. It's not when her dress gets torn apart. It's when that letter shows up. It presents something new and exciting and interesting. In The Lion King, the inciting incident is not when Mufasa dies. It's when Scar is plotting to kill Mufasa and convinces Simba to go to the elephant graveyard and do something dangerous. It's a little more subtle that leads into the action. In a more generic version of things, it's not the big attack on the royal family or the village. It's when the stranger comes to town and then trouble follows. So within your first chapter in that example, you should see a stranger comes to town and then later the big problem, the big attack, or what have you comes into play. And so that goes back to why the mass slaughters don't work with starting your story, because that's not the inciting incident. It's either when you have a time skip, it is the character's backstory, which we don't need to go through, or the inciting incident is something that led up to it, whether it's like a summit meeting, the stranger rolls into town, there's talk of rebels, something like that. That's the inciting incident that leads up to an attack. So understanding what your inciting incident actually is will help you figure out where to start your story. Your inciting incident isn't going to be the biggest, flashiest, most exciting thing. Most of the time, I would say it's going to be something a little more subtle. And a lot of the time, it presents a mystery. And ensuring that you start in the right place will make sure that your reader understands and likes the characters and the places, and they become interested in what's going to happen to them before things really kick off. So those are the 7 common mistakes that I've recently seen. Let me know, have you been guilty of these in the past or maybe right now? Or have you noticed any mistakes that I didn't list here that you've seen recently? Next week, I will be helping you diagnose your manuscript. So if you have been suffering from readers just ghosting you, I'll be going over the most likely culprits so that you can maintain readers.